Hey everyone, I hope that you're doing well. Welcome to another video. Today's episode is the second installment in a series that I've called Questions. Today's episode is about the X100 Original, what my settings are for this camera. A lot of you have been asking me, and I'll be honest with you, I struggled to make this episode mainly because there's not a whole lot to talk about when it comes to this camera. It's a phenomenal camera. I love using it. If you've seen the videos that I've posted when I was in Italy, then you know that I shot with this camera a lot. Most of the time I pick it up, I put it in my pocket, and I go out, I focus, I recompose, and that's it. I don't look at the back of the screen, I don't touch the settings. Even my accessible settings, I rarely touch them. So it's a very simple camera. There's not a lot of options, and you'll see that as we go into this next section. Let's go ahead and jump into the approach part of today's episode. And once I talk to you about approach and philosophy, then we will jump into the actual individual buttons and dials. So the approach. I think I have a special connection to this camera because it is so limited that it's forced me to develop a relationship of trust with it. Okay, now just hear me out. I believe that trust is the most important aspect in any relationship. And if it's not the most important, it's definitely up there on the list because this camera is so limiting. And I think that for anyone who is very logical and methodical, this camera will it will either provide you with a potentially horrible user experience, extremely frustrating, or number two, it can give you or it can provide for you a very liberating experience. For me, I experienced both. The first month that I shot with this camera, I was extremely frustrated. I remember thinking, why is it that people love this camera so much? It's really difficult to shoot with it. I don't know how to edit the files that come out of this. The JPEGs are not as good as people said. And all of just a bunch of complaints because in the beginning, it was very difficult for me. And I changed my approach. And so my approach is very simple. I literally will turn off the back screen and I leave it on the viewfinder only. This camera gives you the option between an optical viewfinder and an electronic viewfinder. And the electronic viewfinder on here is okay. I just find that leaving it in the optical viewfinder mode just works really well for me. And after shooting that way for a month, like 2 or 3 times a week with it, at a certain point, I began to develop trust. I knew that the way that I had my camera set, that if I just focused, recomposed, that everything would be fine. In fact, some of the first images that I made with this camera, I made an episode. If you haven't seen that 1 week that I spent visiting some of my favorite spots on the Pacific Coast Highway, I shot those with this camera. This camera will force you to develop a relationship with it. If you shoot with it enough, you'll eventually learn its limitations, but you will also learn how to bring out the best in this camera. And I think that's a really great quality to have, is learning how to bring the best out of any relationship that we're in, whether it be a relationship with our cameras or with our family or friends or significant others. And that's definitely something I'm working on. So anyways, that's approach. Very simple. Focus, recompose, shoot, put it in pocket, take it out, focus, recompose, shoot, put it in pocket. And now we're gonna go into the next section and I'll go over every single dial and button, and then I will let you know if that's a pre-shoot setting or if it's an accessible setting, okay? Let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so let's start off with the customizable buttons. We'll go from there. This camera only allows you to customize 2 buttons. It has this top button here, which is called the function button, and this bottom button here, which usually says raw, but I've used it so much that the paint has faded away. So this top button here, what I've done is I've set that button to AF mode. And so for AF mode, it has area and multi. And so what area does is with area, it allows you to press this AF button here and you can change the focus point to wherever you want. I don't use that. I just leave it in the middle and then I focus and I recompose. But sometimes, every once in a blue moon, I'll be doing street photography and I need to shoot from the chest. I'll walk with it like this, and then I will just go boom. Whenever I use this option, what I do is I will put it to multi, and what multi does is it picks what it thinks should be in focus. And whenever I use this option, it's a gamble, and I know that there's a 50% chance that I am not going to get the shot. That being said, I've missed a lot of shots, but there have been a couple that have come out pretty well. So I find that I don't really use the function button very often. I just leave it in area. I focus, recompose, okay? This other button here, you can assign a feature to this raw button here, and I just have it set to ND. So ND, what it does is it puts a filter in front of your lens so that it decreases the amount of light that's coming in. So for example, on these cameras, if I'm shooting at f2 wide open, any Fuji camera with a leaf shutter are those really quiet shutters. So look, I don't know, can you hear that? It's very, very quiet. Most people don't hear it. Sometimes I don't even hear it when I'm out there. So with that leaf shutter, it has a limitation. So if you're shooting wide open at f2, you cannot shoot over 1/1000th of a second. So even if you set your camera to 1/4000th of a second in the shutter speed, it won't actually fire at 1/4000th of a second if you are shooting wide open at f2. So in those situations, what I do is I hit the ND filter. And most of the time that works for me. If you are shooting at f2.8 or f4 or 5.6 or f8, then you can shoot up to 1/4000th of a second. So that's for the ND filter, and I use that quite a bit. These two are both accessible settings. That means I have to access those and change those while I'm on the go. And that's about it as far as accessible settings. You have your f-stops. I usually just shoot at f2. I love the way this camera shoots at f2. I think it renders a beautiful background separation. And when I started to do portrait sessions with this, I wasn't sure if I was going to like the portraits that came out of here for two reasons. One, the focal length. This is a 35mm full frame equivalent. And two, because of the f-stop. But I remember I did this photo shoot with Hannah. I met Hannah on Malibu on the beach. And a week later, we ended up doing a photo shoot. And that was the first photo shoot that I did with this camera. I loved the images that came out of it. I loved the colors. I loved just the way that this camera shoots portraits. And since then, I've used it to document different things. And I love the background separation that f2 offers. Other accessible settings you have here, shutter speeds. Most of the time, I just leave it in aperture priority. And my exposure compensation is either at 0 or -1 or somewhere in between. And then you have your shutter button, and that's it. Those are your only accessible settings. It's the only thing that I change while I'm out there. So the main thing here, if you look here, this button here is view mode. So what I do is, right now it's at eye sensor, which means that if I cover this, it'll turn off the screen and then you'll see the viewfinder here. This dial here at the front, this will switch it from optical viewfinder to electronic viewfinder. So most of the time I will just shoot with the optical viewfinder. Every once in a while I will shoot with the EVF just to measure and make sure that my exposure is okay. And then I switch it back to optical viewfinder and I just continue shooting like that for the rest of the shoot. This button here is usually when you're in manual focus, you hold on it, you push it, and then it will zoom in. I don't use it hardly ever, if ever. So here on the side, you have your autofocus settings. You have manual focus, autofocus single, and autofocus continuous. I never use autofocus continuous. Most of the time, it's in AFS, autofocus single, focus, recompose. We talked about that already. But every once in a while, I will put it in manual focus, especially if I'm trying to zone focus. What I do is I use this back button here to focus, and then I recompose. So if you're zone focusing and you're not good with distances, you can literally say from here to that pole, right? And then you focus, and now you put it at f8 or f11, and anything that's around that distance will be acceptably sharp. But I don't really use that very often. Most of the time, autofocus single, but that's what that button is for. Drive mode, I don't really use any of these drives except for video sometimes. Now the video on here is 720 1080p. So I don't really shoot with it a lot, not because of the image quality. I love the character of the video that comes out of this camera. But unfortunately, it's 720, and for this channel, I shoot at 1080 minimum. I don't really shoot with that. Sometimes for my Instagram stories, I will shoot video out of this camera just because I love the way that it looks. This camera does not have Wi-Fi, so I use this adapter. And what I do is I take out the SD card, I put it in there, and it goes straight to my phone. You know, anytime that I need to share stuff while I'm out on the field, that adapter allows me to do that. And I find that sometimes it's faster doing it that way than it is connecting the Wi-Fi on my modern cameras. That's a limitation that I've been able to get past using this particular method. Okay, here you have flash. The flash will not work if you're in silent mode, and I usually have my camera set to silent. Now, if you hold the display back button here, it will turn your audio on, and then your flash will work. And I don't use the flash that often, but when I do, rather than having to hit the flash button, I just leave flash on all the time. And then what I do is I hold the display button, and when it goes on, then my flash is on, and if I need to turn it off, then I hold it, and then it goes back into silent mode. The white balance, I just leave it to auto, and I rarely touch that dial because auto white balance on this camera is phenomenal. What I do sometimes if I'm shooting JPEGs is I will go into the white balance shift, and I will shift it to -3 on the blue and the yellow channel, or I'll leave it at 0. Once again, this is all set before I go out and shoot. And that's it. I mean, view mode, I just leave it to optical viewfinder. Like this AE here and this autofocus, I don't touch those. I don't need those. So we're pretty much done with the video. I just focus, recompose, I shoot, and I trust that the results that I'm gonna get are gonna be good if I compose properly. One thing that I will tell you about this camera, and another reason why I don't check the back of the screen very often, people will often say, well, you might as well shoot film. The point is not that I'm trying to pretend like I'm shooting film. This camera will feel like you're shooting film because it forces you to. If this camera was faster, I would probably look at the back of the screen more often to make sure that my exposure and to make sure that my compositions are good. But this camera, if you press the shutter just even 3 times, you cannot access your menu button. You cannot access anything, right? You can't change it to optical viewfinder or screen because the buffer takes forever, but it will allow you to take more pictures. So it makes taking pictures a priority. So that is the reason why this camera, I don't bother to look at the back of the screen because the buffer, it's just too slow. I'd have to stop and wait there, and when I'm shooting out on the street or when I'm doing a photo shoot, I just don't want to do that. And that's it, guys. It's very simple. I think the ND filter is the only button that I touch on a regular basis, and the shutter button. Other than that, I take it, put it in my pocket, and I take it out, focus, recompose, and shoot. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode. This is one of my all-time favorite cameras. I wish you all a great morning, afternoon, or evening, and thank you for watching. I will see you in next week's episode. Take care. Bye.